Welcome to the 12th video in this Building Interactive website series, which will go over how to add event handlers and listeners to HTML elements inside JavaScript. So a couple of episodes ago, you might remember that we went over inline event handlers, which can detect when a button is clicked or when a key is pressed in a text area or other various events, making use of HTML attributes. However, the problem with this approach is that it mixes the markup or content or the HTML code inside the page with the functionality that's provided by JavaScript. This makes it so that the JavaScript is scattered all across the page instead of being all in one place inside of a single script. So here's an example of what I was talking about in action. So as you can see, when we run this code, there's a P element with the ID of test. So we have a paragraph here, and then we have a button down here which, when clicked, changes this paragraph's text to some other text. So when you click here, the text changes to what's inside this string. And this is making use of the document.getElementById function that we learned about in the last episode. And it's using the .textContent to access the text that's within it. However, as you can see, this is basically JavaScript inside of HTML. So this is JavaScript code inside an HTML attribute, instead of it being inside a script tag with all the other JavaScript in the page. This is especially problematic when there are multiple elements in the page with multiple different event listeners. Now this page is pretty small, so it's pretty easy to change the text inside and what happens when it's clicked here, because it's just 3 buttons. But for larger web pages like the ones that you commonly visit, this kind of code is going to be really hard to maintain over the long term. To consolidate all of these event handlers inside a single script, first we have to create a script tag to contain all of these handlers. And then, to access each of these buttons efficiently, we have to give them all IDs. So this one will be called button 1. And then we can call this one button 2, for example. And then the third and final one, button 3. And then we can define variables for each of the buttons. So, for example, const, because the reference to these buttons is not going to change. So, button 1 is what we'll access first. And then we can use document.getElementById to access them because they have unique IDs. And so button 1 is the ID of the first button. And now we can say button 1.onClick. And then what we're accessing here is the code that will be run when the button is clicked, and we can change it. So the way we can provide a function for the button to run when it's clicked is by simply typing parentheses and then an equal sign, and then a greater than sign, and then a pair of square brackets, or curly braces, sorry. So now inside these curly braces is the code that will be run when button 1 is clicked. So in this case, this is the current event handler, so we can just move this inside here. And then, since it's not inside this attribute anymore, we can change the single quotes back to double quotes, both in this ID string and this string with the new text inside. And then finally we can add a semicolon here. And now we can get rid of this onClick attribute because we've already defined it here. And so now if we run the code, you can see that this button still works. And we can do the same thing for the other buttons as well. And so we could do document.getElementById button2.onClick equals, and then that same arrow function syntax like before, with the pair of parentheses, an arrow, and then curly braces. And if we are only accessing this element once, then we don't need to define a variable for it. So const button1 equals this element, and then setting button1's onClick event is actually kind of redundant in this case because we're only accessing this first button once. So we're simplifying this with button2 here. And so now you can see if we move this event handler here and then do the same thing for the third button by getting its ID, and then copying the onClick event handler and this onClick attribute over to this function. And now we can get rid of the onClick inline attributes. And now you can see all of these buttons still function properly. We've just moved them into a single script to make it easier to maintain. And of course, this works with all the different events that are available, not just onClick. So for example, if we do onMouseEnter instead, then that'll detect when the mouse actually hovers over this button. So if I were to run the code and then hover over this button, you can see this text here changes. And additionally, you can get specific details about the event by typing in a variable name inside these parentheses here. In this case, I'm going to do E for event. And then since there's a single parameter in here now, I can actually get rid of the parentheses surrounding the E. And then some specific details about the event are included in this E object, such as E.target, which actually returns the event. It returns the element that received this event. So in this case, it's this button with the ID of button2, because that's what's clicked. This can be proven by modifying it. So for example, if I were to set its text content to clicked, just to test it, then you can see this button's text changes to clicked. And this is the exact same thing that would happen if I were to do document.getElementByID button 2. As you can see, it does exactly the same thing. Except using e.target is just a quicker and more convenient way to reference it. However, what if we want to add another on-click event handler to this button 2 element? Well, if we try to add another one by assigning another function to this on-click property of the button, of the second button here in this case. In this case, we can try changing the color of the text by using .style.color. So we can set it to red, for instance. And now you can see if we click this button, it only changes the paragraph's color to red. It doesn't change the text or this button's text. However, this can be fixed by making use of another property called, or another method, I should say, called addEventListener. This method takes in 2 parameters. The first of which is a string containing the name of the event. So in this case, it's click. It's exactly the same as the property name that you would give when normally assigning a function to an event handler, except without the on at the start of the event name. So in this case, it would just be click. And we can do the same thing for the second click event handler here. So you can see we can change the on click equals to addEventListener and then the left parentheses and then click in quotes and then a comma to separate the event name from what will happen after the event occurs. And we also need to add an extra right parentheses to the end of this right curly brace to ensure that this pair of parentheses here is closed. And so now if we run the code, you can see that when this button is clicked, both of the event handlers activate. And this also works with different events. So for example, let me check which events are available. So we can change this click event for the first event handler here in addEventListener to mouse leave, so that when the user stops hovering over this button, this event handler runs. And as you can see, it works correctly. So this addEventListener method supports all of the events that this classic .accessor way of assigning functions to various different elements works. And this is actually the recommended way of adding event listeners to an element by using addEventListener, because it reduces conflicts between event listeners and allows you to add multiple of them for the exact same event. However, this concludes episode 12 of the series. Thank you very much for watching, and make sure to look out for the next episode.